Chapter 31 of Adapted Version of Night by Elie Wiesel. One Sunday, as half of our group, including my father, was at work, the others, including me, took the opportunity to stay and sleep. At around 10 o'clock, the alarm started to go off. The block leader gathered us inside the blocks while the Nazi soldiers stayed in the buildings. It was easier to escape when the alarms went off, since the electricity in the barbed wire was cut. The standing order for the Nazis was to kill anyone found outside his block. Suddenly, the camp looked like an abandoned ship. No one was moving around. Next to the kitchen, 2 pots of hot soup had been left alone. 2 pots of soup. In the middle of the road, 2 pots of soup with no one to guard them. So much food going to waste. Hundreds of eyes were looking at them with hunger, but who would dare? Fear was greater than hunger. Suddenly we saw the door of Block 37 open a little. A man came out slowly, crawling like a snake in the direction of the soup. Hundreds of prisoners' eyes were watching him move. Hundreds of men were crawling with him, scraping their bodies with his on the ground. All hearts were filled with envy. He was the one who had dared. He reached the first pot. Hearts were beating harder. He had succeeded. Jealousy filled us. This poor hero was committing suicide for some soup. In our minds, he was already dead. Lying on the ground near the pot of soup, he was trying to lift himself to the top of the pot. Either out of weakness or out of fear, he remained there, unable to get his strength. At least he succeeded in pulling himself up to the top of the pot. For a second, he seemed to be looking at himself in the soup, looking for his reflection there. Then, for no reason, he let out a terrible scream, a death scream like I had never heard before, and with open mouth put his head into the pot of soup. We jumped at the sound of the gunshot. Falling to the ground, his face covered with soup, the man moved for a few seconds, then he stopped. That was when we began to hear the planes. Almost at the same moment, the barrack began to shake. "They're bombing the Buna factory," someone shouted. I anxiously thought of my father, who was at work, but I was still happy because it could mean freedom. While we had heard some talk of the Nazis losing power in some parts of Europe, we were not sure if it was true, but today this was real. We were not afraid, and yet if a bomb had fallen on the blocks, it would have killed hundreds of prisoners, but we no longer feared death. Every bomb that hit filled us with happiness, gave us new confidence. The bombs lasted more than 1 hour. If only it could have gone on for 10 hours. Then once more, there was silence. The last sound of the American plane went silent in the wind. And there we were in our cemetery. In the sky, we saw a long trail of black smoke. The alarms began to scream again. Everyone came out of the buildings. We breathed in air filled with fire and smoke, and our eyes had new hope. A bomb had landed in the middle of the camp, but had not exploded. We had to move it outside the camp. In the very center of the camp was the body of the man with soup on his face, the only victim. The pots were carried back to the kitchen. The Nazis were back at their places in the tower, behind their machine guns. An hour later, I found my father. Several buildings were bombed, he said, but the factory was not touched. In the afternoon, we happily went to clean the camp. Chapter 32. 1 week later, as we returned from work, there in the middle of the camp stood a black wood structure. We learned that soup would be given only after attendance, which lasted longer than usual. The orders were given more violently than on other days, and there were strange feelings in the air. "Hats off!" the Nazis suddenly shouted. 10,000 hats came off. "Cover your heads!" 10,000 hats were back on our heads very quickly. The camp gate opened as a group of Nazis appeared and circled us. 1 Nazi soldier every 3 steps. The machine guns on the towers were pointed toward the middle. "They're expecting problems," whispered Juliek. 2 Nazi soldiers were walking toward a prison building. They came back with a boy between them. He was a young boy from Poland, a prisoner who had spent 3 years in concentration camps. He was tall and strong, a giant compared to me. His back to the wood structure, his face turned toward the head of the camp. He seemed more sad than terrified. His hands were tied, but they did not shake. His eyes were looking at the hundreds of Nazi soldiers, the thousands of prisoners around him. The Nazi leader began to read, "In the name of Reichsfuhrer Himmler, prisoner number stole during the alarms. According to the law, prisoner number is charged with death." Let this be a warning and example to all prisoners. Nobody moved. I heard the beating of my heart. The thousands of people who died daily in Auschwitz and Birkenau and the crematorium no longer troubled me, but this boy gave me deep despair. This ceremony, will it be over soon? I'm hungry, whispered Juliek. The Nazis stepped up to the young boy. He was assisted by 2 prisoners in exchange for 2 bowls of soup. They wanted to cover the eyes of the young boy, but he refused. After what seemed like a long moment, one man put a rope around his neck. He was about to tell the assistants to pull the chair from under the young man's feet when the boy shouted in a strong and calm voice, "Long live freedom! Shame on Germany!" The Nazi had completed his work. Like a sword, the order cut through the air. Hats off! 10,000 prisoners gave their respect. Cover your heads! Then the entire camp, block after block, walked past the dead boy and stared at his eyes, his tongue hanging from his open mouth. The Nazis forced everyone to look him in the face. Afterwards, we were told to go back to our block and have our dinner. I remember that on that evening, the soup tasted better than ever.